Hi, everybody. This is Saad for the Saad Truth. As usual, I have another fantastic guest for you today. I've got Matt Kibbe. I thought it was Kibbe. It's spelled Kibbe. Kibbe is a very famous Arabic dish, but Matt assured me that he's not Lebanese or Arabic. Matt used to be the president of Free the People, an organization that seeks to promote or is currently the president of Free the People, an organization that seeks to promote libertarian ideals. He used to previously be the president of Freedom Works. He is the author of 3 books: Give Us Liberty, a Tea Party Manifesto with Dick Armey, Hostile Takeover, Resisting Centralized Government Stranglehold on America, and the book that I delved into the past couple of weeks and only finished a few days ago, Don't Hurt People and Don't Take Their Stuff, a Libertarian Manifesto. And I was particularly keen to speak to Matt because I live in the greatest of parasitic states. Welcome, Matt. How you doing?
It's an honor to be here.
Oh, it's such a pleasure to have you. You reminded me that we met at, I think, the Global Liberty Institute gala prior to the following day's event. Was it at the Glenn Lowry Awards? Was that it?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, right. Well, it's so good to see you. So okay, let's jump into it. I guess the first question that many people would want to know: define for us some of the key tenets of what it is to be a libertarian.
Yeah, like you can get a 10 hour answer from most libertarians on this, but I like to say you should be free to live your life as long as you don't hurt people or take their stuff. And it's based on a philosophy of individualism. Individuals are the objective building block of any civil society. And we just think that beautiful things happen when people are left free to innovate and cooperate and work hard and do all of the amazing things that we celebrate. All of that was because some individual had an idea and found partnership with other people and did something greater than they could have done by themselves. And that process of figuring stuff out is only possible when people are free. So I like to say that most people, except for psychopaths, have a little bit of libertarian in them because this is how we live our daily lives.
So, okay, the ideal of libertarianism can be applied. I mean, freedom is an all-encompassing term. Of course, it could apply to economic freedom. It could apply to political freedom, to freedom of speech, to uh, being free from intervening in foreign lands, and therefore you become an isolationist. What does the term freedom encompass when you're talking about libertarian ideals?
So there's sort of two sides of the same coin, and I think part of it, and I certainly quote her in my book, and I was very inspired as a young man reading Ayn Rand. Her half of the libertarian coin is all about my right as an individual to control and define and live my own life. And she, of course, was a refugee of the Bolshevik Revolution, a young Jewish girl that fled to the United States, gave up everything in order to do that. So hers was that primal scream that you don't own me, I own myself, and I'm going to make my own choices. The other half of that, which I don't think is in any way unrelated, is the part where free people choose voluntarily to cooperate, and through cooperation you can achieve some of these really profound values that I think make the human experience interesting. Ideas like respect, ideas like trust, ideas ultimately like love. These are like the highest achievements that an individual can find, and that's only done in cooperation with other people. And I think some libertarians are guilty of de-emphasizing that community that comes when people are free to live their own lives, because we are social creatures. Even libertarians, I mean, maybe there's a few who aren't, but we're social creatures as well. And the really beautiful things that happen when people are free are something that's greater than anything we could accomplish on our own. And that in no way undermines the principles of individualism. It's just the logic of that extended to how we organize as communities and as societies.
Very interesting. I just want to tell a tangential side story about Ayn Rand. and then I'll come back to sort of more substantive, meaty issues. I was actually, I think it was the trip where we met at the Global Liberty Institute. It was in that trip. I was walking on the fancy street. I don't remember what it's called. The one in is what was in Palm Beach where we were, right? Was it Palm
Yeah,
Beach?
Palm
Yeah.
Beach. Yeah.
So anyways, on that street, my wife and I were just strolling, and we discovered this antiquarian bookstore. And I mean, that's basically my fantasy, to walk into an antiquarian bookstore. So we walk in there, and of course, I see the most expensive book that they had was a first edition Origin of Species, which of course would make me very titillated given that I'm an evolutionist. But then there was another section that were all first edition, and I think some signed copies of the various books by Ayn Rand. Now, I know a gentleman in Texas, this billionaire oil tycoon, who's a huge Ayn Rand fan. So I call him up after we had left the place, and I said, "Hey, this is a story. What do you think? Do you want me to try to connect?" He goes, "Well, why don't you go buy them for me? And of course, I'll pay you back," which kind of make me chuckle because it's his what he suggested could only come from the mouth of a billionaire who thinks that as we're walking to the beach, I just happen to have maybe 50 or $60,000 laying around that I can pay it for him. So, anyways, I don't know if you would know who that oil tycoon is. I'm not going to mention him, but a huge fan. I'm not sure if he ended up buying those copies. But if you are interested, there are first editions in Palm Beach ready for the taking. Anything you
I
want to
have a
add? Go ahead.
I have a suspicion who that is, and I should point out, and this makes me an extremely weird person. One of the most romantic books my wife ever got me was not a first edition signed copy of Atlas Shrugged, but it was signed by Ayn Rand, and it meant a lot to me again because like
Of course.
this was the first Anthem was the first book I read as a 13-year-old that sort of turned me on to this entire philosophical exploration.
Yeah, so I want to talk about your trajectory, which you just kind of hinted at when you were 13 and first were exposed to Rand's work. So some of the other people that I was already familiar with, but in reading your book, it kind of I got re-energized and sort of saying, "Oh, I got to dig deep into these guys." Of course, there's one. Do you say Mises or Mises?
Mises, von
Mises,
Mises.
which by the way, I cite him in the Parasitic Mind in a different context. And then you've got Hayek, and then you've got more recently Rothbard. So these are some of the main guys that we might think of when we're thinking about libertarian philosophies. Are there any other folks that, if we're trying to create kind of a genealogy of that thought, who might other people be that we might be missing here?
If you dig into the footnotes of Hayek and Mises, you're going to find some continental philosophers who are fairly obscure, but absolutely the Scottish Enlightenment philosophers, particularly Adam Smith, but the whole host of guys that were writing in that milieu that Adam Smith was writing in. And this book, by the way, is my very serious attempt to translate the entirety of the theory of moral sentiments into a tweet. And this is back when tweets were short, so it was a heroic effort, but I think I mostly captured it. There might be some nuance lost.
Got you. So with other, I think Edmund Burke would be part of that gang, correct?
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. So 13
Oh,
years old.
by the way, Jerry Garcia, I absolutely needs to be part of that mix.
Oh yes, the I saw your whole ode to the Grateful Dead. Yes, I got you. So okay. Oh, and of course, Rush, fellow
Yes,
Canadians.
yes,
Have I
yes. One,
have I surpassed the Rush singer as the most impressive Canadian, or is it Jordan? Is it that bastard Jordan Peterson, or where do I rank amongst illustrious Canadians?
I think I would put all three of you into this category.
You're being
I
too
guess
kind.
yes, I guess I'll put Neil Young in there, but he's gotten a little bit goofy in his old age.
Got you. So no Justin Trudeau, I presume.
No, not at
No.
all.
Okay, so you're 13, you get into Ayn Rand, and then take us through your intellectual development from there.
So when I was 13, I bought my first Rush album, and back then you couldn't just order things online, and you couldn't search for the kind of music you liked, and so I haphazardly heard this. Someone else was playing it, and I went to the record store to find the album I wanted. Of course, they didn't have it because old school bricks and mortar stores didn't really have what you wanted. So I bought 2112, because it had this cool cover on it. I'm like, that's cool. I'm going to listen to it. And I was devouring the music. And back in the day, you would open the liner notes on the vinyl record case, and you would read about the band, you would read the lyrics, and there's, you know, the first song suite of 2112 is borrows liberally from Ayn Rand's little novella Anthem. And at the bottom of this, it says, dedicated to the genius of Ayn Rand. And I'm 13. I'm like, who's that guy? Who's that dude? And then I forgot about it because I love the music, but the name was weird. So it stuck in my head. I found, maybe weeks later, I found an old beat up copy of Anthem at a garage sale. This is how ideas used to spread. It was quite accidental. And I, of course, devoured it. And I set out on this course to find her other books. That particular book was so old that Atlas Shrugged hadn't been written when that particular book was published. So I went and found The Fountainhead as the second book. Eventually, you get through her nonfiction books, and she's the one that told me as a teenager, you need to read Ludwig von Mises if you want to understand economics. So this was my sort of intellectual path. I was a very introverted, dorky kid who was quite shy. So I just read a bunch of books, and I discovered through trial and error that quoting Ludwig von Mises and Ayn Rand to women, hoping that they would go out with you, was a tragic mistake. It did not work.
But you are, if I remember correctly, in meeting you, you are tall, correct?
Yes, I'm 6'1".
Well, there you go. But then again, most people to me are tall. Certainly, most men from the United States. In Mexico, I'm the tall one, but anywhere else, I'm the short one. So you weren't able to compensate in reading, in citing those guys by your height. That didn't work out, the calculus.
I will say that the first woman who I was interested in that wasn't scared away by me offering her a book to read is my current wife, Terry. So she sort of passed the dork test or whatever that test was. I was not a romantic, but these ideas, like like when you get turned on to ideas, you just become obsessed, and that obsession is uncontrollable sometimes.
So then you went to university where, you know, that interest flourished. What then led you to decide? I think you had, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but you had started graduate school, but then left it. Is that correct?
Yeah.
So
So
what
I went
happened
to
there?
so I I was actually editing the academic journal called Market Process at George Mason University. George Mason is one of the best places to go in the world if you want to study Austrian economics. And I discovered, and this might resonate with you, it might trigger you. I discovered the petty and vicious nature of the politics of tenure, and it was a real turnoff to me. I Again, I'm young and idealistic, and I think we're exploring ideas together, and we're going to lift each other up. It wasn't like that at all. So the irony is, I eventually got away from my academic pursuits to go to Washington, D.C. and get into politics, which is the irony. Academia was too political for me, so I got a job at the Republican National Committee as their chief economist instead. So that logic may not make sense unless you actually have been in a university and understand just how awful it can be.
Given that I actually have something to say about the machinations within academia. I could spend probably 10 hours talking about that, but I'll mention one thing that I think does have a link to George Mason in a moment. But given that you've lived a life, a cerebral life, notwithstanding that it wasn't, in academia, have you ever entertained the idea, hey, I think I could probably go back now to graduate school and polish it off, or there's absolutely no interest in doing that?
I have an interest in it. It bugs me a little bit that I didn't finish. Obviously, not enough to have finished, but I've explored several times maybe finishing my PhD at a university in Europe that has a very different sort of style of that. The one thing I am good at is I consider myself a decent writer. So writing a dissertation based on something that I'm working on, it's a possibility, but honestly, it doesn't affect the work that I do. So it it would be a vanity project as opposed to a necessity.
I would say for whatever it's worth, you didn't ask me for my advice, but just do it. You know what I mean? Like don't don't leave that thing not closed, just close the parentheses. And even if it serves you absolutely no interest other than, as you said, a vanity thing, although I don't think you don't strike me as someone who would do it for just vanity purposes, just do it. By the way, I'll mention two quick stories, then I'll go back to the George Mason. In my latest book, in the happiness book, towards the end of the book, where I'm talking about the psychology of regret and how you should try to live your life without hopefully looking back at your life and regretting things that you did or didn't do. I mentioned two stories, which I hope will resonate with you, because you'll see in a second why they're relevant. Story one is of a gentleman who had fled Germany as the Nazis were coming in. He moved to Canada, was always interested in being, a well-educated person, didn't have a chance because of life circumstances, retired in his 60s, and then said, "Hey, you know what? I'm healthy and I think I've got things to offer. Why don't I go now and pursue my undergraduate?" In his 60s. This was at the university that I'm at before it joined. There were two separate universities that joined together that became Concordia University. So he was at this place called Sir George Williams University, if I remember correctly. So he does his bachelor's, and then he's in his 70s now. Says, "Hey, I'm healthy. I'm still vigorous. Let me pursue my master's." Finishes his master's, and then I think in '96, so this is maybe 2 years after I had joined as a professor at Concordia, the newspaper at my university, and the front page was "Finally a doctor at 91 or 92," and then within a year of that, he passes away. So it's actually the exact opposite of vanity, right? It's the purest reason for doing a PhD, which is it's not going to serve you in any way in a careerist sense, but he just did it for the love of it. So that's story one. Story two, another gentleman who got his MD in, I believe, in University of Vienna in Austria, uh, became a medical doctor. Then in 1967, while training to be a hematologist, picked up a PhD in biochemistry. But his first love had always been physics. So after he retired from a long career in medicine and well into his 70s and 80s, he then, at the age of 89, completed his PhD in physics and actually came on my show. So based on those two guys, you're a fetus. So you still have
Yeah,
tons of time.
I'm just a baby. So
You're
there's a certain logic to, like, my career trajectory has been further and further away from sort of wonky, heavy academic stuff towards communicating as simply as possible to a broader audience. But those old silos, and you're a walking, talking example of this. Those old silos that separate academia from communications and popular culture don't exist anymore. So I can see where it would make more sense than perhaps 10 years ago when I was sort of maniacally focused on how do we reach a broader audience? How do I turn on more people? It's not going to be just quoting the dead economists that I love so much.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, let me close the loop on the George Mason. So back in 2011, I had been invited to give a talk at Chapman University. Chapman University had that at the time had hired the dean at George Mason in the Faculty of Arts and Science to become the chancellor at Chapman University. You're not nodding your head. Is that because you know who I'm talking about?
I don't know what you're talking about, but I know a lot about Chapman. One of my friends, Vernon Smith, spent quite a bit of time there. Um,
Well, I'm going to come to that. So I was invited to the thing because it called the Economic Science Institute, or I can't remember what it's called. So Vernon Smith, who's the Nobel laureate, had been whisked away to join Chapman, and they had a really nice group. And I had been invited, and the chancellor, who had been poached from George Mason, and the president had been very, very keen on me joining Chapman. And the whole setup had been, all the T's were crossed and all the I's were dotted. But then, precisely for petty academic reasons, it fell through, although I was officially told that it was due to budgetary reasons. It had nothing to do with budgetary reasons. And that has always been a very sour point because I thought that, we had finally made it to to the promised land, meaning Southern California, and at the last minute it has been whisked away. So you're exactly right that your disdain for the political backstabbing in academia is certainly not pretty. Do you want to add anything to that, or should I move on to the next question?
Just very quickly, I'm remembering one of the, I won't name names, but one of the places I was considering was in London to finish my PhD. And this is back when I'm still a Tea Party guy, and cancel culture was a big thing there that I hadn't, at least wasn't on my radar screen yet. And I thought, like, if anything, it might be a little bit prestigious to have this guy who writes these best-selling books be part of your program. And he was scared. He thought that it would draw undue attention to his department, so that obviously never materialized.
Well, I tell you, I often call academics a new species that is an invertebrate castrati class, meaning not only do they not have spines, they don't have testicles. And it's so grotesque because the mechanism of tenure is precisely to make sure that if you were otherwise cowardly by disposition, well, the mechanism of tenure can now serve as the courage that you need to compel you to speak out, because by definition, you can't be fired. And most academics, if you go boo, they suck their thumb and they go into a fetal position. Uh, I find that so grotesque because it would be so nice in the same way that we select Navy SEALs on their physical abilities, on their bravery. It would be nice to have intellectual Navy SEALs in academia, but we certainly don't select on bravery.
Well, the solution probably isn't within academia. In my sense, you would have an opinion about this. It's got to be sort of breaking those rules from the outside in and forcing these old tired institutions to either follow or die in the process. And I think again, like the fact that there is now a place where young people can, I make up a word called self-curriculate. You can actually find the ideas and the thinkers and the books and the explorations that you want, and you can do that regardless of who you are, regardless of whether or not you're the right race to get into Harvard. You don't need permission anymore, and I think that might either discipline these old tired institutions or just put them out of business.
I think the only obstacle that I see to what you're talking about, which is that now, knowledge is truly democratized, right? You can pick your 20 top professors in any field and go to their lectures online and learn in ways that you couldn't have imagined 15 years ago. How do we deal with the imprimatur of the credentials? Is there a way for us to solve that?
That's going to require like the first brave few. Peter Thiel
Sure.
has spent years encouraging people not to go to college and to go straight into innovation. You need like first generation people that are going to stick their necks out and do that and make it normal so that when you go out there to get a job, it's not just assumed that a degree from an accredited government approved university is the best way to judge someone's ability. But it's a cultural institutional shift that requires somebody to go first.
Right. I one of the things that I've been most disappointed in my academic career, and this is now my 30th year. I can't believe it. My 30th year as a professor, uh, is that I thought that more academics would be intellectuals, and they're not, right? So I think you exactly understand what I mean. So think about the old, continental European public intellectual who could talk about the philosophy of aesthetics if you want, who could talk about formal logic if you want, who can talk about Austrian economics if you'd like. He may not be an expert in any of those, but that person is a well-rounded intellectual that can speak intelligently about a broad number of fields. Christopher Hitchens might be an example of that, even though he didn't have a PhD and he wasn't, of course, an actual academic or a professor. I find that academia has become very much careerist oriented, so that when I first started going to conferences, all these super fancy academic conferences, and I would try to engage people with ideas, I I found a lot of them bafflingly shallow, right? Because they knew how to play the game. I need to publish a certain number of papers. And okay, of course, that's important. You need to be productive. You have to push the research frontier. But can we just go for a coffee and talk about some idea? And so, in a sense, I could be reading your book, Matt, and you can exude greater intellectualism than some of my psychology colleagues who've published 100 papers, who, once you ask them about anything short of what they publish on, they're babbling fools.
Yeah, performative technocrats. And
That's right.
in that way, it's like the bureaucracy in academia feels almost exactly like the bureaucracy in government or the bureaucracy in corporations, where, you know, the performative art of doing what you're supposed to do overrules the things that you would really hope that they were capable of doing.
Yeah, exactly. And I've seen this even in the pedagogic orientation that professors use when, let's say, they're teaching their doctoral students. So I've seen colleagues who will teach their doctoral course as a way to game how to publish in certain journals, right? So you may or may not know these statistical techniques. Well, this journal really wants you to do a mediational analysis. And so let me teach you how to do a mediational analysis, because it's going to be very unlikely for you to publish in this important journal if you don't do that. Who thinks like that, right? I mean, nature doesn't abide to your methodology, right? In some cases, I might use this methodology, this data analytic technique, this. And so I always found it fraudulent in this, I mean, in an epistemic sense. I don't mean fraudulent in the sense that you're cooking the data or plagiarizing a la Claudine Gay, but it still feels fraudulent to me, because you're not saying, I'm interested, let me discover something in nature. You're just playing a game, and I despise that. And by the way, maybe to my credit, or maybe it was a fault, I refused to play that game, so that I specifically chose to not publish in certain journals, because then I would feel inauthentic if I simply responded to the reviewer's quest just so I can get my paper in.
This is one of the fundamental struggles with academics who are influenced or explicitly of the Austrian tradition in economics. Is Austrianism, by definition, is sort of multidisciplinary. There's history, there's philosophy,
Right.
there's psychology, there's all of these things that influence what we do, and the fetishism about making economics a science has replaced all of that with really esoteric equations that have extracted the humans and their actions out of the whole process. So it's very difficult for Austrians to succeed in those kinds of institutional incentives that you're describing.
Yeah, no, that's beautifully said, because of course, I saw this even in my own training. So I was trained in my PhD within the behavioral decision theory framework. So, my doctoral supervisor, who's a cognitive psychologist, was friends with Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman. One of my professors was Richard Thaler, who won the Nobel Prize for behavioral economics. And of course, that approach to decision making is, to your point, is so radically different from the ultra mathematical folks. Now, by the way, it's not as though I'm intimidated for mathematics. I come from a mathematics background myself, but I quickly realized that, as you said, the economists who were we used to call them the quantoids, uh, they truly did suffer, not to get Freudian, but they did suffer from physics envy, right? Because if there's a lot of Greek symbols, then holy God, I must be doing something important. But if you're doing the Austrian stuff, the synthetic thinking, the big thinking, then that's kind of wishy-washy bullshit. You need to show me a triple integral for this to be meaningful.
Exactly, exactly.
And do you feel that has there been an autocorrection to that, or has the mathematical orgy continued unabated?
Well, it continues in academia, but I think it also delegitimizes economics as a profession. And the one thing that's even funnier than lawyer jokes or economist jokes, because we've become a laughing stock because they have created this belief that there's some sort of mathematical formula to figuring out the inputs and the outputs, and if you do all of these things, and by the way, we're having the government do all those things to manipulate the economy, we will get X plus one. And of course, they're always fundamentally wrong about everything. And part of it is that pretense of knowledge. This is a Hayek quote: "The pretense of knowledge that goes into the scientific pretensions of fake economics."
So I didn't know that term from Hayek, but I'm going to link it to one of my former uh, professors for a year-long pro seminar in cognitive studies in my PhD. Has a paper on the illusion of explanatory profundity. And the idea is, I mean, exactly to that point. So I then applied that concept to the brain imaging paradigm. The idea is that people, when they see an image of the brain in a paper with all these colors, because it corresponds to the different lit up regions of the brain, it just feels sciencey, right? Whereas if I didn't have that image, even though that image doesn't predict anything, it has zero explanatory power to anything, but it just feels sciencey, right? So with one of my current doctoral students, who's kind of lagging his feet if he's watching right now or listening, we're looking at how something is packaged affects how sciencey it feels. So you're using these completely irrelevant cues, whether it be the triple integral or the nice brain image, to signal that this is very rigorous, when in reality it's explaining nothing.
Yeah, yeah. Well, they're losing their credibility, and I think scientism applied all over the place, tragically, is undermining the fundamental, essential nature of scientific exploration and discovery. And of course, we saw that in spades during lockdowns and our religious obsession with Faucism. Right? He's like, I am the science, and at some point you start to doubt science instead of doubting the guy that's pretending like he knows what he's doing.
Yeah, and you, just for the viewers, you kindly sent me a paper on exactly on that, which I look forward to reading. Uh, I mean, I guess in a sense, whether it be Fauci or others of his ilk, what they're doing is they are exactly not exhibiting what a true intellectual would, which is epistemic humility, right? I mean, the more, and it sounds like a cliche, but it truly is true, that the more I know, and I probably know more than most people, the more I realize how little I know, because I'm actually aware of all the knowledge out there and I know nothing. Whereas
Yeah.
the people like Fauci, perhaps the God complex, perhaps the white coat, I am science. What a grotesque, non-intellectual bent that is, isn't it?
Well, this goes back to the academic disease that we're talking about, but it's sort of built into the process when it comes to government action and government bureaucracies and all of these arrogant people with so much um, arrogance that they think they can redesign a complex social order. And this is one of the fundamental libertarian critiques of central planning, generally of government attempts to redesign the economy, is they just don't know enough, and they couldn't possibly know enough, because the whole purpose of an economy, it's not a place, it's not a thing, it's this process of people figuring stuff out and taking all of this dispersed knowledge and bringing it together in a world that is in real time radically uncertain. And if you pretend like you can redesign that from the top down, you're going to have small and catastrophic human disasters. Ultimately, this was the Austrian critique of central planning, and we've seen it play out again and again, but we're still having the same argument.
What was there something? I mean, I've often asked the following question as applied to the ancient Greeks, where I ask, say, a classicist, what was there in the water that made the Greek miracle possible? And of course, there are several possible answers that one can give. So similar question, what was in the water that made the Austrian way of thinking when it comes to these issues uniquely different from other traditions?
Well, I'll make up an answer that I think is mostly true. They come from, starting with Karl Menger, who's an economist living in Vienna, Austria. Ludwig von Mises, inspired by him and some of his students, becomes part of the Vienna Circle, the
I was going to
famous,
ask about that. Okay, good.
yeah, famous interdisciplinary hangout where, for whatever reason, some of the smartest people in history are gathering together and having arguments and getting coffee and hashing things out.
Look at this guy.
In,
Sorry, I don't know if you know this guy.
I know his name, but I don't know him that well.
Oh, you should read his stuff. It's absolutely mind-blowing. Kurt Gödel. Go ahead.
So this is all happening, and in the middle of this, this guy Hitler decides to take over Austria, and Ludwig von Mises has to flee to the United States. Hayek flees to the London School of Economics, and all of that interdisciplinary stuff is kind of halted in its tracks, to be picked up in other places, but it's probably never quite the same. So I think there was probably that magical moment where intellectual life was as it should be, where people were willing to put their ideas on the line, willing to have that conversation, willing to listen to people from other disciplines and figure stuff out. And I think that's where the interdisciplinary nature of the Austrian school comes from.
Oh, I mean, you're speaking to my heart because I'm probably the epitome, to my detriment in academia, the ultimate interdisciplinarian, in that I've, published in countless I mean, I've published papers on psychiatric disorders in medical journals while housed in a business school, right? I mean, I have a paper on Munchausen syndrome by proxy and a Darwinian analysis of that. What does that have to do with consumer behavior and economic decision making? Nothing. But I didn't care because the problem interested me, and I said, "Oh, I think I've got something hopefully interesting to say about this," and so I went for it. Now, the same university that I mentioned earlier, Chapman, a few years after the first foray of trying to hire me, tried to hire me again. And one of the problems that they had with me was that my research, while great, I'm using their word, while wonderful, seemed too scattered, because I had given a talk where I demonstrated the number of different places where one can apply the evolutionary lens. So by definition, I had structured my talk as one that traverses many disciplines to show that the evolutionary lens can kind of unlock the mysteries in many fields. They viewed that as a detriment because you have to be a hyper specialist. It's grotesque, Matt.
And by the way, the other factor I think that goes into Austrians and perhaps might very much reflect where you and Jordan Peterson have found yourself. The Austrian school was also defined by the events that consumed all around. Fascism and Hitler on one side, Stalin and communism on the other side, and here you have these classical liberals who believe in free people and free markets and the free exchange of goods and services and ideas and everything else, surrounded on all sides. So I think if you look at Mises' early work on money, and then his critique of the failure of central planning, and then Hayek's entire project was really a response to central planners, not just socialists, but John Maynard Keynes, who thought he could manipulate the economy through macroeconomics. So what they're known for is their critique of the failures of government planning, and that of course attracts a lot of libertarians. But there's the methodology and the intellectual tradition, but there's also the circumstances that force them to explain why these were really bad and anti-human ideas.
Very interesting. Of all the different intrusions that a government can commit, and maybe it's difficult to come up with a hierarchy. The one that probably has caused me the greatest amount of pain, and most recently over the past few years, as the book royalties of my highly successful books have come in, is taxation, right? I mean, until the book royalties, I mean, I'd written previous books, but they hadn't been so massively successful that it caused a psychological existential pain. And when you're paid as a professor, when the taxes are taken at the source so that you only see half of it right away, then that's a way for you to psychologically kind of swallow it. But when you get the money and you take ownership of it in your bank account, because it's not taxed at the source, because my publishers are American, so they send me without taxation. But then under the mechanism of world income, Canada and Quebec take, you could go on Jupiter and make money there. It's Quebec and Canada's money. So because I had already exceeded a certain threshold of what my income was, my additional income was taxed at 58%. So that now there is something unique, Matt, and you'll agree as a successful author yourself, there is something unique. All taxation can be very painful because all people work hard for their money. But royalties are unique in that they are part of the collective knowledge that humanity built. That's why Ireland doesn't have taxes on art creation and on book royalties, because they recognize that that's a unique thing. Whereas in my case, I only have 42% rights to my neuronal firings, to my personhood. So I work from January till about September for the government. And in September, the government says, now you keep your money, but not really, because the 42% that you can keep, if you spend anything with that 42%, we tax you at 15%. How is it that people tolerate this? Now, before you answer, I'm going to answer it for you. Could it be that the parasitic state rests on the premise that it requires suckers like me to fund the rest of the Ponzi scheme, whereas most people benefit from the parasitic state, and therefore they're never going to speak out against it? Go ahead and write other good books, Jew boy, and give us the money.
The um the fact of the matter is, and this is a favorite libertarian slogan, taxation is theft. And vulgar democracy, where 50 plus 1% of the population gets to do whatever they want to the other 49%, is just outsourced theft to a third party. And it's hard to explain this to people because we've been conditioned to expect the government to do X, Y, and Z, and there's all these salacious promises that they make us when they're trying to get our votes. But it really comes down to two questions, like, would you ever cross the lawn to your neighbor's yard, knock on his front door, and hold him up and steal his money because you have this beautiful idea that you're gonna go help other neighbors, let's say with childcare? You would never do that. And yet when you go to the voting booth, you do the same. You actually do hold up your neighbor based on some promise that some politician's going to make. And this is a core question about the organization of civil society. Do we use cooperation and respect and trade and all of these beautiful things that we aspire to do, or do we use violence? And my view is that there's not good government or bad government. There's only limited or unlimited government. So if you want to limit the amount of theft, you have to limit the size of government.
So can you ever foresee a time? So in Canada, and I'm almost certain that the history of taxation, I mean personal income taxation is roughly the same in the US. I think in Canada in until 1917, no income tax. Then, oh, we just need, it's going to be very temporary. As Milton Friedman said, there's nothing as temporary. There's nothing as permanent as temporary government, services and so on, programs. 1970, oh, we're just going to tax a few people very temporarily, and then we watch for the next 105 years where the orgy becomes parasitic beyond, imagination. Could you ever conceive of a time where the fulcrum will swing the other way, that we're back to, I don't know, 5% income tax, or that train has sailed and you shall never return to the good old days?
It's difficult to imagine how to unwind it, which is why I would support a flat income tax instead of replacing it with a national sales tax, for the simple reason that no government program's ever going to go away. And all we'll end up doing is adding a value-added tax or a national sales tax on top of all these other things, because every idea that is implemented by government becomes a monster. It takes on a life of its own. There's all of these interests that ensure that you can never unwind these things. It is absolutely true of the tax code, and there's something even more insidious going on. And I know more about the US than Canada, but there's only so much money you can extract from people through taxation. There's only so much money once you've hit that, then you start borrowing money that you can't pay back, and there's only so much money you can borrow. The third and most insidious way that governments expand their power is by printing currency and expanding the money supply, which is an explicit transfer of wealth from the have-nots, the working class, to all of the special interests and elites that know they know how to play the game. They know how to protect their wealth from inflation, and that's where we're at now. And you would think that that would cause a grassroots revolution. All you got to do is go buy a dozen eggs
Yeah.
and
Ah,
wonder these like I think they've literally tripled in cost since lockdowns in 2020 at my grocery store.
yeah.
This should be a revolution because they're stealing your money, but it's hard to see, right? It's obscured by the complexities of money and financing and all that stuff. So no, I would be pessimistic about this, except the possibility of the emergence of crypto technologies and cryptocurrencies as Hayek would have said, as an end run around this top-down system. I think that's why people like Elizabeth Warren are going bananas about Bitcoin, because they know that these sorts of technologies completely undermine the Ponzi scheme of tax, borrow, spend, and print.
So earlier I said that one of the reasons why people may not fight back against very high taxation is because they the the net benefit to them outweighs whatever they pay in taxes. I think in Canada, 40% of people don't pay, I think, federal income tax. And the histogram of how much the top people pay is just outland. It's unbelievable. It really is. And then you hear people saying, "Oh, but why don't you pay your fair share? Why do I have to pay 25 times what you pay for the exact same server? What's the moral?" Well, it's just the psychology of envy. It's the psychology of resentment. Why did you write the great books that sold a lot, whereas I didn't? And therefore give me your money. You owe me that money. But could it also be beyond what I just said? Could it be that most people feel helpless to be able to in any way alter the Goliath that's moving? I mean, what's my voice going to change? And therefore, let me just go on in my little life because it is what it is.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of helplessness and frustration and just throwing up your hands. And politics is a joke, and you don't expect either party to actually do anything that they said they were going to do. And this I think is ultimately what broke. I was a Tea Party organizer,
Right.
and our whole mantra spontaneously emerged, not from the top down, but we were for individual freedom, fiscal responsibility, and constitutionally limited government. Every activist anywhere would say some version of the same thing, and they sort of heroically rose up and said, you know what, I'm going to get involved in the policy debates. I'm going to get involved in the political process. I'm going to elect people who will promise to sort of live by these values. And every step along the way, we were the precursors to the modern conversation, where anybody that challenges the government in Washington, D.C., you're called a bigot, you're called a racist, you're called a fascist. These are not new tactics from the Alinsky left. And then they survived all of that. They elected Republicans that said they were true to these things, but nothing changed. And I think this is how Trump ultimately courted at least some Tea Partiers to come over, because he's like, you know what, they don't respect you. The system's broke. It's a swamp. Let's blow it up,
Right.
figuratively speaking. So
Right.
I think people are cynical and frustrated because they have every right to be cynical and frustrated about their ability to reform what is supposedly a representative democracy, supposedly constrained by constitutional limits on government power. It's hard to find the American vision in what's happening today.
If you were to compare, so when I read let me just put it up again. People go get this book, 2014. Go get it right now. As I read it, I mean, you certainly were intimating, there's a revolution coming, people are taking action, people are assuming personal agency. So if I were to take that optimistic message and fast forward 10 years later, has it improved or has it worsened? Have people uh, adhered to the clarion call, or are you more pessimistic than you were in 2014?
So it's and there's a chapter. It's been a while since I read it, but I think there's a chapter called "The Right to Know," and I'm very optimistic about the democratization of knowledge through technology. Um, Completely not anticipating, although I describe the problem as like the problem with all of these beautiful technologies is one, they're incredibly liberating used the right way, and two, they're an incredibly dangerous way that the government can control us. And what we've seen, and I think I'll even draw some optimism out of this, but the insane amount of granular censorship to come out of particularly the I'll call it the defense industrial complex, the intelligence industrial complex, tells me that people with the freedom to figure stuff out on themselves was an existential threat to I'll call it the regime. This is a libertarian word, but I don't know what to call it. But the machine, right? Like you have this insanely expansive government power structure, and they're actually going in and dictating to Twitter employees, "Hey, this guy just told a joke about a politician. That we have to stop that." It tells me that they're scared, and
Right.
it tells me that Elon Musk it has to be a hero in this story because he blows the lid off of this. And there are now plenty of new places where people can discover this process. So I believe in the wisdom of crowds, and I believe that these technological tools are very much a good thing, but the government has weaponized them against us, and we have to figure out how to solve that problem.
Right. Speaking of Elon Musk, I retweeted, someone said that someone had nominated him for a Nobel Prize, and I retweeted and I said I second that. And as soon as he bought Twitter, I had gone on record. I think I'd put out a clip on my channel where I said that of all the great initiatives that he's been involved in, and that's more than probably 10,000 men put together, none will come remotely as historically important as him having opened up the public square. So I'm assuming, based on what you said, you would wholeheartedly agree with that premise.
Yeah, I would endorse that. But you can also see this gets back to somebody has to go first, and in a lot of ways, Elon Musk has gone first, and he has an insane amount of FU money
Yeah,
that protects him to a great extent in ways that it wouldn't necessarily protect a college professor.
right.
But just look at what they're doing to him. Like
It's
all of
unbelievable.
the attacks on him and his contracts with his companies, and Biden himself saying we got to investigate that guy. The intimidation is real,
Yeah.
and he just happens to be. It looks like he's tough enough, but he's definitely wealthy enough to sort of fight that machine. But it's an amazing thing that normal people probably don't want to bring that sort of weight down on their families, right?
But that's why, by the way, in the parasitic mind, in the last chapter, I say, activate your inner honey badger. And the reason why I do that, the reason why I use the honey badger, and some of my listeners have probably heard me explain this on a few occasions.
He don't give a shit.
He don't give a shit, right? So you see when, the reason why people like Elon Musk and Donald Trump are so intimidating, because what's more intimidating than an animal that if you sting it, it keeps walking, if you bite it. I mean, I don't know if you've ever seen this footage. There's a footage where a constrictor has completely suffocated a, a honey badger. The honey badger finds a way to get out and escape when it's like literally almost dead. The instinct, instead of now running as far away from the massive constrictor, it says, I'm going to kill you. It comes back, kills the constrictor. There are jackals coming that are trying to steal what he just killed. He fights off the jackals. That's Donald Trump. That's Elon Musk. You may like them, you may not like them, but God damn it, you're going to respect the fact that they're honey badgers.
Yeah. And that's like in a very different sense. Somewhere in my book, I quote probably my favorite quote from Ludwig von Mises about the entrepreneur. And the entrepreneur is that guy that looks around the corner of history and imagines a better future. You know, maybe it's a product or service or whatever it is. And all along the way, the masses are mocking him and laughing at him and trying to stop him and trying to marginalize him. That's what we need, but that's always what um, American culture has been about. Like our founding was an impossibility,
Yeah.
but some crazy bastard said, you know what, this thing is important to us. We're going to do it. We're probably going to get killed, but we're going to do it anyway because we have this radical idea that the individual is more important than the government, and that is it's almost a immaculate conception kind of thing.
Right.
I think you could imagine a very few people brave enough in public life to stick their necks out like that. But this is how social change happens. Somebody goes first. Other people say, hey, that looks like a really good idea, and I'm not alone anymore, so I'm going to join. And eventually, it was everybody's idea in the first place. That's how social change happens.
Exactly. Well, there's a great quote by uh, JBS Haldane, who's an evolutionary geneticist who was also very famous for having these great quips. And I always say that my favorite scientific quote by anyone, and that's saying a lot, there are a lot of very quotable academics throughout history, is one that I actually put as an epigraph in the last chapter of The Consuming Instinct, my 2011 book. And what basically JBS Haldane argues is that radical scientific revolutions or ideas go through four stages. I don't have the exact quote in front of me, but I'll kind of paraphrase it. First stage, when you first are exposed to an idea, oh, this is such bullshit. Stage two, well, this is largely true, but largely unimportant. And then I don't know what the third stage, and then the final stage, to your point, is, oh, I always thought so, right? And this has the reason why I love this quote so much because it's the perfect autobiography to my scientific career because I tried to come into the business school and Darwinize it. How do we apply evolutionary thinking to understand entrepreneurship, to understand behavioral economics, to understand my area of consumer behavior? And most people said, what are you on? What do you biology? I mean, if you want to do biology, go study giraffes. You're in a business school. This is bullshit. And then of course, if you're dogged enough, if you're enough of a honey badger, if you are true to the scientific method, the evidence eventually builds up. And then the same person who sent you an email in 1997 and said you were a bullshitter writes you 20 years later and says, we would be delighted to have you as our plenary speaker. And regrettably for him, I'm an email hoarder. So I kept the email from 97 when you said I was a complete bullshitter. And depending on what my mood is that day, I might actually remind you that you gave me that email 20 years ago. So exactly to your point, if you're dogged enough, stick to your principles and hopefully you will win. Before we wrap up, I have one other technical question, then I'll ask you about any current projects you're working on. Is there, and so often when I look at the literature on how political orientation affects something, how is happiness affected by whether you're conservative or liberal? It's always broken up into these camps: conservative, liberal. Is there a rich body of literature that looks, for example, at the psychological profile of a libertarian? Is there a lot of that work? And if not, why not?
I think the thing that comes to mind is some of the great work that Jonathan Haidt has done on this subject, and I am not an expert on this. I'm aware that the libertarian mindset, the don't tread on me, let me work my own path, let me fail and succeed on my own merits. I realize that that's not necessarily a normal thing. Neither is processing all of your world around you through logic and the laws of economics. So I think we libertarians have to get better at translating our ideas into emotionally compelling stories, and
Yes.
that's that's where my career has taken me. And my wife and I started Free the People 6 years ago now, and we really just wanted to tell stories and and turn people on. You know, there's basically two types of stories, both of which are some version of the hero's journey, right? It's either a horrible oppressive government that has held you back, and you fight against that, and you succeed or fail. But that is a version of the hero's journey. But there's also this beautiful version where you create something beautiful, and you do it in cooperation with other people, and you help other people, and you lift them up, and that's where progress in society comes from. We libertarians got to get a little bit better at that second version of the story, because we're very good at raging against the machine,
Right, right.
and it's righteous to do so. But um, there's some really amazing things that people do when they're left free to cooperate, and I think we need to focus on that more, to show people, like, if we're the lost leaders out way out front, wanting to shift um, more power to civil society and away from government bureaucrats, we got to show people how it works in practice, not just on a chalkboard.
Well, of course, I wholeheartedly agree with your sort of the importance of narrative. And as a matter of fact, there are evolutionary arguments that support that, we are a storytelling animal, right? I mean, that's why literature appeals to us. And so, and I've noticed it in my own writing, right? So that whenever I'm, in the parasitic mind, I link it to my own personal journey. So if I want to talk about identity politics and how that's an idea pathogen, well, what better way than to show you what happens to the perfect society, perfect in quotes, that is built on identity politics? It's called Lebanon, right? And so now I can take you back to Lebanon and link you to my childhood. That becomes a very powerful narrative. So I think you're spot on that, contrary to the mathematization of economics, people respond a lot more to narratives than to triple integrals. Okay, last question. Although of course I could keep you here for 4 hours. What are some current projects that you might want to tell us about that people need to know about?
Three things quickly. One is we produce a lot of documentaries and a lot of stories. I still do some economic explainers because I can't help myself. My team is basically a video production cream, a bunch of artists and technologists that know how to both tell a story and hopefully get people to see it. Um, we've gotten in the last year and a half into comedy, because we've seen the revolution happening where comedians, starting with Dave Chappelle and Joe Rogan, Russell Brand, so the list goes on and on and on. People that probably came from the left, but then this speech policing, anti First Amendment authoritarianism coming from the left has pushed them to sort of reconsider. It's because comedy is allowed to say things that apparently the rest of us aren't allowed to say anymore, and there's a lot of power in that. So we're doing a lot of comedy. In a lot of ways, I consider it a gateway drug for young people that are not going to sit through a 3-hour podcast about Austrian economics, but if you sort of plant some of those nuggets in shorter, funner bits, that's a good thing. So one's called Comedy is Murder, because speech is violence, and the other is called Adults Are Talking. Lou Perez, Andrew Heaton, great comedians that we're collaborating with. Another project, very different, is something that I'm working on in cooperation with Senator Rand Paul. It's called The Cover Up, and it's a series of investigative conversations with really smart people like Scott Atlas, who we were talking about earlier, like Jay Bhattacharya, like Rand Paul, probably some of the folks that did the Twitter files. But I don't think we have an answer as to what exactly Fauci et al. Were covering up. I think we need to know, because we need to make sure that it never, ever, ever happens again. And I've structured it in a way that I don't really have an ending to this story yet, because I don't know exactly what the ending is. That's going to be released. The first episode is going to be released just in a couple days. And finally, I just bought a copy of your book on happiness, because my wife and I are trying to write a series of stories about our life called Love, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness. And
Oh,
it's a way to try to get people to appreciate some of these principles we've been talking about, but just in the context of our own lives, the ups, the downs, the tragedies, the successes, and that has to get done this year. Otherwise, I'm going to do something to publicly humiliate myself for failing to do that, because I think this is our job, right? Our job is to tell stories, and we have to do it It has to be personal. I know you go back to your childhood to tell fairly devastating stories. Well, everybody deals with that stuff, right?
Yeah.
Everybody in their own lives have to deal with bad things and good things, and we got to make it so that we can humanize freedom, so that people can sort of be passionate about taking the risks that are required of you to get to happiness, right?
Right, beautiful. Well, it does come across in this book, your love and affection for your wife does come through, and it actually had struck me because one of the things that people often say about my public engagement is that, you know, how effusive I am in the public display of love that I have for my wife. Actually, my last talk that I gave a few weeks ago, actually in Montreal, the person who introduced me spent quite a bit of time talking about that. So it's lovely to see a fellow man honoring their wives the way that you do. Such a pleasure having you. I look forward. I think we had talked about the possibility of me coming on your show. I'd be delighted to do so at some point soon. And of course, you could come back anytime that you like. Thank you so much for coming on the show, Matt.
Thank you, sir.
Cheers.